what's cool about Tai Chi is that there's always like these weird esoteric roots that kind of bring all of this. And so Tai Chi is Taoist on purpose, right? And you can't escape that because it's in the name. It's kind of Tai Chi in itself is a Taoist concept. So, and the roots of Taoism are found 5,000 years ago. And for me, there's something that's really cool that kind of colors a lot of what we do about Tai Chi is the fact that there was something called the steps of Yu, which is literally something which is 5,000 years old. And Yu was kind of the ancestral shaman, ancestral king that kind of settled a lot of China. So the steps of Yu, which apparently Yu developed, were based on a star pattern. So this whole idea of moving and stepping is part of kind of the shamanic tradition of Tai Chi, right? So as we go up in time, there's always this idea of like, well, stepping is actually really important. It's symbolically really important. Moving through space is symbolically really important, right? And that to me is the fun part where it colors, where even the old Taoist shamans would dance. You'd have all these different steps and patterns that they would, of stepping according to different constellations and different directions was part of their ceremony, was part of the Taoist magic.
Okay.
Right? So, to me, that's what's fun. When you start doing the Taoist form, you go, well, doing the form, the fact that there's patterns on the ground, that's an echo of this kind of ancient Taoist tradition of stepping on the stars and creating these patterns.
And are those steps for the stars the same as we use in the form?
They're not. But I think it shows how this idea of moving through space is a really important idea and a really important concept in Tai Chi.
Okay.
Right. And one of the main problems in Tai Chi today is that there is almost no stepping. That it's so slow, it's so rooted that people forget that actually if you look at the form, it's a series of steps. It's not a series of like planting yourself and now you do an arm movement. If you actually really do it, it's a series of steps. The body is constantly moving, stepping forward or back, shifting to the side. And so the steps, I think, were kind of forgotten.
But the steps are actually supposed to lead.
Exactly, but the steps are actually one of the most important parts. They're truly the root of the art. In some ways, we should start with the stepping. Because the stepping is actually at the core of everything that was done.
Because if you only did stepping, you'd be pretty well off in a situation.
Exactly.
You got that.
The stepping can save you or win. Uh-huh. Right? You can win because of your stepping, but if you don't step, you're gonna lose always. So the steps of Yu lead us to then the next thing, which I think is actually one of the most important things that nobody thinks about, which is the magic square that we find in the Hetu map or the Yellow River map. Right, and that's something that's almost I think I showed it to you. Nobody looks at, but it's the one where in the center is a 5-pointed cross, right? With 4 points and then the point in the middle, and that represents something very specific, which is the square of Earth and the dome of heaven, and the supporting point in the middle is the pillar that holds up the dome of heaven, right? So it's a pillar that is rested on the square of the Earth and supports the dome of heaven. And that pillar, symbolically, is both the axis mundi, the axis of the world. It's the mountain that holds up the heavens. Weird fact, but actually, all the pyramids, the Babylonian ziggurats, right, the stepped pyramids, those are all representations of that very idea. Right? You even find that in Buddhism, this idea of a tower, which basically connects Earth to heaven and supports the heaven. Well, in Taoism, man is also that central pillar, that you're the connection between heaven and earth.
Okay.
Right? So, but symbolically, and in terms of the stepping and moving through space, what's important is this idea of the square at the bottom and circle at the top. And we're in the middle.
Okay.
Right? So we step along the square to create circles.
Create movement.
To create
circles.
Yes. Right? So that, to me, if you start thinking, if you have that in your mind, that metaphor in your mind, then suddenly the stepping becomes very different, right? Because we already know from Tai Chi classics, we do straight lines to attack, circles to deflect. While straight lines to attack, so it's like, okay, we're doing square steps, right?
Forward, back, left,
For,
right.
exactly, forward, back, left, right, and right. And then circles are the deflections. But they come out of the squared steps, right? So you have to think geometrically with your stepping in order to generate rotation among the upper body. And that's what all of the steppings are about. And the fact that it matches essentially these old ideas of that you find in Taoism, like in this Yellow River map and all that, because these are at least 3,000 years old.
And for the Yellow River map, you mean the magic square?
Exactly. So the Yellow River map then is also a magic square, and the magic square also gives us a hint about stepping, because again in the magic square, so it's a grid of 9, and the central square is the number 5, which is what you find in the Yellow River map. And then each square, if you add all the squares, you always get the same number. You always get 15, no matter which way you.
And diagonally too.
And diagonally, exactly. Well, that's your hint. That what it does is it maps out the kind of the amount of energy that you're pushing in any direction. If you're going fully forward, you still have to keep your center the same, and you still have to have a little bit of energy that's actually aimed backwards, because otherwise you're throwing yourself forward. So the idea is the amount of energy is constant, is always the same. It's just directed in different directions. Because
the magic square is 10 and 0.
Correct.
Right.
You never have a 0. It's always a 1.
It's always 9 and 1 or 8 and 2.
Exactly. So you're changing the proportions of energy. The total amount of energy is always the same, but you never want to have one square which is 0, because you always want to have a little bit of power which is actually reserved towards the opposite direction. So if you're going fully back, you actually have a little bit of intent forward, but the center square stays the same. So you never want to be off that balance. You're always finding that line that goes through essentially your center.
So the 5 would, or the numbers would kind of recommend weight, or not recommend, represent weight distribution. So
exactly. So the magic square, and again, this is where you want to make sure that you don't take theory to such an extreme that it's actually preventing the proper application. Right? These are all kind of they're hints. They're ways of thinking about it. They're not rules.
They're
it's
not
not
prescriptive.
Yeah. But what it does is it keeps reminding you. Okay, yes. If I'm going to do something, I want to make sure that I preserve that center, and that I don't overcommit or undercommit. Right? That if I'm going to do something, if I'm going to commit to the side, that simultaneously I'm also countering it by committing to the rear slightly, so that my forward push is not completely unbalanced. So that's what all of this kind of maps out, is a way of always thinking in terms of center, moving forward. If you're going to the sides, right, to the diagonal.
And the 5, you're always balanced.
And the 5 reminds you always be balanced. So you're never so forward.
You might go to what was a 1, but you still need to bring it to a 5.
Exactly.
Because that's your new center.
Exactly. So you're always maintaining that center no matter what. So even as you push. Okay? And of course, also it's a grid. So now it gives you the 8 directions, which is also what we find in the Bhagavad. And this is where also there's what to me was a mistake or a miscommunication, where people think that, like in the 13 postures, they talk about the 8 moves in the 5 directions, right? And people think, the 5 directions is correlates to the 5 elements, right, that we find. I think that's wrong, because I think the 5 is the 5 that we find in the Yellow River map and that we find in the Magic Square. The 5 is, and actually they say the 5 directions is front, back, look to the right, look to the left, and then central equilibrium. Well, because they don't say up and down, because that would give you 6. They say central equilibrium, which means they're talking about a vertical line. The vertical line is the same vertical line that you find in the Yellow River map, symbolizing man connecting heaven and earth. So that's why, for me, it matches much more to the Yellow River map than it does to the 5 elements. Because the 5 elements, the big problem, and this is where later on this is going to be important, the 5 element tell you, well, forward is fire and it's up. So therefore, all forward movement is up. Right? And then the 5 elements also, you have to kind of rearrange them if you want to have them fit in a forward, back, right, left, central equilibrium map. You have to kind of rearrange them and say, okay, well, actually, instead of being 5-sided, it's actually 4, and then the middle is earth, and that's what's... So you have to kind of finagle the 5 elements. But also this idea that, the 5 elements then tell you, well, you're going to go slowly and down to the right, because that's, it's like a metal is always going to be this way. But, wood is always, it's a slow rise on this side. It's like, yes, but then it means you're locked. It means you can,
So that's the mapping we wouldn't use.
That's what, exactly. That's what I'm saying, that's actually taking you to the wrong side. Because in stepping, what you want is, you have the directions, right? Which is, what direction are you moving in? And then you have the orientation. Yeah, again, because you have the square and the circle, right? So you're stepping along a specific geometry. You have the vertical line, which means that you can step in that geometry, but you can go up and down as you do that. So you can go forward and down, or you can go forward and up. You can go back and down, back and up, because you're moving up and down along this, this square, along the vertical. And meanwhile, the body can swivel in all sorts of directions. So you can move forward as you're swiveling back.
And going up.
And now you start seeing and go, wait a minute, that's exactly what you do, for example, the fair maiden weaves to and fro. It's a rollback as you step forward, rising up. Right? And that's something that you can't do if you're always thinking, oh, well, rollback is always backwards, or rollback, or, that everything has an inherent quality and you can't get away from it. It's like, well, no, I can do rollback while stepping forward.
Okay.
So my body's stepping forward, but I'm rotating to the back. Right? So you can do 2 things simultaneously. Now, the one thing which is important, and this is where the symbology is like a metaphor. It's like poetry. It hints at something. It doesn't tell you these are the rules that you must follow, but it hints at something. And the fact that it's a square, that the earth is represented by a square, and that basically you're stepping into is a geometry, that's important, because what it does, it means that you have to pick you pick your lines that you're stepping along. And that means that your intent is linear. So even if your foot is doing you're doing a circle step. The circle step, the circle itself is dictated by the fact that there's something in your way. So that's where reality and theory kind of clash. So that's why the square stepping generates circles.
Right.
So that's why the central metaphor for me is what it comes out of the.
It's not really that your hands are doing circles; it's that your hands are being taken in circles.
Exactly.
By your sense.
Yeah. So that's why that central metaphor of the square on the ground, the pillar that supports a circle, is important, because that pillar is basically the body. So the steps are taking you along these diagonals or straight lines, and then the central pillar transforms those square lines into circles. Because the thing is, and this is where theory and practice interact. Is like we talk about straight lines, but the truth is there are no straight lines, right? Because if you punch, it's actually a series of circles coming out of the rotation of the shoulder, the rotation of the elbow, rotation, right? So there are no straight lines in a punch. But if you map out the energies, the path
your fist travels is a straight line.
Exactly. So this is where
scaffolding is making circles.
Exactly. So this is where you have to be careful, because we keep going back and forth between talking about the metaphor, the vectors of energy that we're drawing, and what's actually happening. When you step, it's actually a rotation in the hip. But we're talking about stepping forward, or stepping in a straight line. There is no stepping in a straight line, which is why in all of this, I think what's important to remember is that what we're really talking about is intent, right? That even the squares.
The part you can control.
Exactly. And the body's going to express that intent however it can. So if the intent is square steppings, it doesn't mean that you're stepping square. It means that your intent is sharp, boom, right? It's diagonals or straight lines. Okay. What comes out is a circle step. But what that,
or even a straight step and pivot.
Exactly. You're doing circles because you have to, because it's the body. But the intent needs to be clear, like, okay, if I'm here and I'm going to pivot to the side, what I'm doing is I'm going from this side to now the rear diagonal.
Now, whereas if your intent is to go straight forward, and you half step forward, so there's no pivot, same-sidedness, other than what you pretty much have only done a straight line.
That's right. And there's a reason why in the 13 postures, the very first segment that we do, only has half steps, because what it does is you're here, you're doing half steps, you're doing all these moves, but you're only staying centered, straight line, same foot forward. So you start by doing half steps. It introduces you to the idea that you're doing straight lines. Second segment is when now you're going, okay, we're going to control distance by playing with the vertical. Because the second segment of the 13 postures is where now suddenly you're doing drag downs, doing brush knee where you're taking big steps, right? So now you're doing, steps, yeah. But they're actually, you still haven't taken a full step yet. So, but the important thing is this, so the second segment of the 13 postures is half steps, but now we're playing with vertical, making them bigger, making them smaller, right? And then the third section is the first time we actually have full steps, where now we're going from left foot forward to right foot forward, and what happens there, right?
Right.
So that right there is a hint as to the progression of complexity, right? Going from straight lines, because taking full steps is also a rotation, right? And we kind of see that with Play the Pipa, where we're doing a step, we're keeping the same foot forward, but it's a step that changes the rotation of the body. Right?
Yeah, so we think of that in terms of intent. Is that a step 90?
No, it's a step to the diagonal. But so you're if you're facing here, you step back and sit so that now you're facing the diagonal. And then you step back to front.
Intent? Is that a two-part intent or a one?
Eventually everything is one. That's the thing. And this is, again, if you think back to the magic square, any change generates power on both sides.
Right.
So my center's here. So if I turn this way, I'm also generating, so I'm turning to my right forward. It means I'm also dealing with my left back.
Okay.
Right?
So that's your intent as you roll back and the fist comes in.
Correct. So my intent is to draw, I'm drifting to the right, to the diagonal. And then when I sit down, that becomes a pull to my rear left, automatically.
But is your intent going to the rear left, or is your intent only down?
Well, by then I've already stepped. So my intent to the step is to turn to the diagonal and then go down. Does that make sense?
Is your intent down at the end?
Yes, because if you break it down,
diagonal and then down,
and then down. If you break it down to the pieces, then it's diagonal, down, and then back to front, up.
Okay.
Right. But then eventually it all looks like a circle, like a single move, because you
right.
step
Those
them
are
off.
keyframes we've chosen to let you know.
You break the movement down.
You should pass through here.
You should exactly. But the idea, though, and what's important is this idea that here I turn to the diagonal. Boom, boom, right? So the geometry is clear. Even though what it looks like is, oh, my hands are waving through space, but what you're doing is diagonal, down, up. What your arms are expressing is a spiral. But the spiral comes out of the fact that you're going boom, boom. My arms, naturally, will express a spiral. What my feet are doing, they're walking the diagonal and back. What comes out of this is complexity. So you can start with very simple rules and very linear rules, but the minute you start stacking all these other elements, you generate actually what are very complicated spirals. Because in the end, it's all spirals, right? But that's because you're stacking these different elements. And this is what's important is to remember, okay, feet are going along linear paths while the body can do rotations. Because what it means is that now my intent, my central pillar, right, is moving in a linear direction.
And that's what I'm thinking about?
That's what, exactly. Because now it means that if I'm facing somebody, I want to go either forward, back, or along the diagonal.
Even if I want to do a spiral, I'm not thinking about the spiral.
Eventually you're gonna think about the spiral, but you're gonna think of it by first going, if I'm gonna do, like for example, punch under the elbow. If I'm gonna sidestep the guy so I can punch in the ribs, I'm gonna first step to the diagonal and then step to the second diagonal. So what you've done is square. Meanwhile, the hands are doing circles, right? But the body's going. I'm going diagonal, turn diagonal. So your stepping are sharp,
right angles.
Right? Boom, boom.
45, 45.
Correct. Meanwhile, the hands are doing circles. And this is one of the differences between Tai Chi and Bagua. Because Baguazhang, so the martial art, it's all spirals. Because what they're saying is we're all going in circles. So in Bagua, you would generate a spiraling energy the whole way. In Tai Chi, you're actually going step, step, boom. So you're stacking squares and circles.
So you might make the exact same physical movements in a given circumstance.
Yeah.
But in Bagua, your intent is a spiral?
Correct. In Tai Chi, the steps are the stepping is square. Hands can be circles. In Bagua, even the stepping is circles to match the hands. So and this is not a matter of saying which one's better or wrong. Bagua and Tai Chi are going to have things that are very similar, but internally the intent is slightly different. Because to me, what makes it important and also cool in Tai Chi is this idea that basically I'm going to step, and just the column of my body, the vertical of my upper body, is going to be enough to have an impact. So if I step, boom, I've actually shoved.
You are creating some inertia and snapping in a different way, right?
Yes, right, because I step and then move. So, but this is where it all takes. It's the hips, the waist is the commander, where you're turning and turning. But this is where the stepping and working on the stepping is important, because if you're not engaging in the stepping and you're doing it just very slowly, then it becomes, now I turn this way. Now I go, I'm going to go this way. And what you're not training in is the So this is where there's keeping in mind this idea of square in the bottom, vertical, circle on the top. It becomes so important, and why it maps out onto this yellow river map, which the Hitu map, something like that. And that then becomes a much more active way of thinking about stepping, because now we have to think about, okay, step to the diagonal, what is my relationship to my partner, my opponent, and just going, okay, if I'm here, I can go forward, back diagonal, back right, forward diagonal. And it opens up a lot of things, and it's also a little more precise, because now you can think of, okay, I want to take up this square to this diagonal. I want to take up this square depending on how my feet are. I'm going to move to the diagonal, move to the next diagonal. It makes thinking about the steps a little more square and rigid, but out of that comes precision, and then that evolves into circles, which is the important thing. It evolves into creating these spirals. So it's not like now your Tai Chi is square and hard. It's realizing that out of that kind of precision of stepping, you're generating these spirals and these circles, right? But you have to think about the steps. You have to think about the feet moving through space, the direction that they're drawing in, and you're realizing basically also you're drawing the Bagua. Right? You're drawing the 8 places of the Bagua as you move through space. Drawing the square, which has 8 directions. You are the pillar that emanates from the ground, and around you is the circle of the heavens. And that's basic Taoist kind of imagery. It's basic Taoist symbology that you're expressing through the Tai Chi practice.